they never get harmed. Nothing ever happens to them. Governments change, parties change, elections are held. Years pass by. But even if they occasionally change countries, move their accounts from country to country, they always manage to stay afloat. They do whatever is necessary. Sometimes they stand behind a politician, sometimes they pretend to stand behind an ideology. If necessary, they arrange elections, support coups, but no matter what, they never give up their seat. From the outside, they are the ones who take the money from the people, or rather, they transfer it to their own accounts through underhanded deals. They are perhaps the people's greatest enemies. In some parts of the world, they are specifically called oligarchs. Everyone now knows that the 86-meter yacht Le Amor Vero, owned by Igor Sechin, the head of the oil giant Rosneft, is worth 110 million euros. They also take the trouble to investigate the owner's identity, and it turns out to be the person who appoints the top-level officials in the national security services. The first yacht seized in Italy was the Lady M, worth 65 million euros. Its owner turned out to be steel tycoon, Alexei Mordashov. In other words, one of Putin's closest friends. Almost all investments of Russian oligarchs are in Western countries and are directly connected to Putin. Yakunin was the head of the Russian Railways Company until 2015. Another oligarch, Kesayev, was the tobacco industry emperor. Kovalchuk was Putin's closest friend before becoming a billionaire businessman. He was a member of the Ozero cooperative. Malofoyev managed Putin's relations with conservative and religious circles, while Potanin, as the richest man in Russia, provided financing when necessary. Pugachev's chateaux on the Côte d'Azur were also seized. The Rothenberg dynasty, which transformed from a sports cooperative to natural gas and then to a global holding, can be said to be closer than family to Putin. Timchenko was personally Putin's partner in the Ozero cooperative, and the legality of their relationship is no longer questioned. In fact, we could extend this list and show other yachts one by one, but the issue with oligarchs is truly not just about a few yachts. Have you ever heard of oligarchy before? The generation of the 70s actually knows it. Once, before the September 12th coup, people used to say, "Down with oligarchy." Oligarchs were pointed at with fingers, and there wasn't a curse left unsaid about them. Although after a while, those who cursed them wouldn't hesitate to join their ranks. But that was to be expected. In short, a lot of water has flowed under the bridge since then. The world has changed. Oligarchs are no longer secretive or mysterious people. Their possessions, yachts, where they live, which mansion, in which country they are known. Some have become football team owners, some are partying lavishly in Ibiza, and thanks to social media, or because there's no more shame or hesitation, or because until recently there was no restraint, they were openly parading around as oligarchs until the invasion of Ukraine. When Ukraine was invaded, the oligarchs, 95% of whom are Russian, and 90% of those are connected to Putin, suddenly emerged, and their possessions, yachts, mansions, and football teams began to be seized one by one. So why are 95% of these oligarchs Russian? Why do they come from Russia? It's certainly not a coincidence. Let's take a look at their origins. The world had come to the 20th century through centralization. You were either part of an empire or you were nothing. At the turn of the century, there were two empires left with territories consisting of a single piece. The Ottoman Empire, spanning 3 continents, and the Russian Tsardom, covering the entire Asian continent. Like other intercontinental empires, they too managed to endure until the First World War.
Isn't it really something valuable? Could you please let me know what exactly it is that you are looking for or hoping to achieve in this particular situation?
When Bolshevik Russia ended the Tsarist regime with the 1917 revolution and established the communist system with the ideology of Marx and Lenin, it set up a network of cooperatives that were interdependent in production components to dominate the Tsarist geography. This new empire, consisting of dozens of republics and independent states, was named the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, for short, in 1922. In this system, for example, one Soviet produces leather for a shoe, another Soviet produces the mold, and yet another produces the laces. None of them could have a self-sufficient economy on their own. The key to each Soviet's loyalty to the center was its dependency on another Soviet. At the center, a dictator with an iron fist set in the seat of power.
A sports coach named Yusuf is coming to a Davos train. Even if he works, a citizen watches his fruit, and a Japanese appeared.
The world encountered wars again, about 20 years after the First War. As old empires transformed into nation-states, the survival of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics led to a bipolar world, and the years of the Cold War after the war. On one side stood the USSR, and on the other side was another unnamed empire, the United States of America.
The other pole, federative elsewhere. Thank you for watching. Even though it was the capitalist empire, the United States of America.
Each pole, even though it was the federative capitalist empire at the other end of the world, the United States of America. Now every country could develop by aligning with one of the two empires, according to its own strength. Defending oneself was also dependent on this. You would either be a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, or the Warsaw Pact. It didn't matter whether it was on land, in the air, in Vietnam, Korea, or Cuba, or even in outer space or on the moon. You were either with one or the other. The restructuring and reform movements in the economic and political system throughout the 1980s aimed to liberalize the economy and bring it back on track. Central planning was abandoned in inefficiently operating state institutions and enterprises. The focus was shifted to profit-oriented production. Resources were allocated to increase welfare instead of the arms race. And this period of change was known by two names, glasnost and perestroika, or in Turkish, openness and restructuring. These two words were forcing the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, a superpower, to give up the Super League.
What we said went in a different direction. There is a line for the analysis of countries. And it is about the unification of the government. I cannot agree with this.
Giant corporations, trillion-dollar contracts, arms trade, oil lobbies, exploitation, and war. These things we mentioned are the results of some people imposing their influence on the country's governance and engaging in the sharing of capital with bureaucracy. For 70 years, the facilities and factories owned by the public began to change hands for next to nothing after the dissolution of the Soviet Socialist Republics. In the newly established Russia and states, in this new change happening behind closed doors, some would sink, while others would rise. Capital that didn't exist couldn't change hands, but a new class could be created. The group that sided with the state and knew what to share with whom, namely the former compradors, transformed into the oligarchs of the new era. The dark officials of the system were being converted into businessmen, and those who got along well with the ones at the top were told to go ahead, comrade. After the transition to a market economy, especially with the privatizations during Boris Yeltsin's era, These new Russian wealthy individuals emerging in connection with political power would show that Russians also knew how to enjoy the world's blessings. Thus, a new order was established where about 100 people owned 35% of Russia's total wealth. After the dissolution of the USSR, the Kremlin, wanting to prevent the ensuing chaos, also needed a cleanup operation. For instance, during Yeltsin's era, foreign policy was entrusted to a single oligarch, Berezovsky. Berezovsky was not an ordinary name. He managed to embezzle Aeroflot, which he was in charge of, on a large scale. Khodorkovsky, the world's biggest tax evader, was to be stopped with police measures, but those like Potanin and Friedman, who could maintain their influence, would endure until the Putin era and remain on the scene.
The Russian Federation must be free, must have its own economy, must have its own human and civil rights and freedoms.
When Putin came to power, he took control of the economy. His first target was to decisively fight against the mafia-like oligarchs. He aimed to re-establish state control in the industrial sector, which is key for Russia. He realized that the business world could conflict with foreign policy and was determined to bring the oligarchs, whom he believed were hindering the country's strengthening, into line.
You all know very well how privatization took place in our country in the early 1990s, and how, using various tricks, including those that violated even the laws in force at the time, many market participants then acquired state property worth billions.
Indeed, after 2000, he significantly reduced the political influence of the oligarchs. Using methods similar to today's, he sent some into exile and imprisoned those who did not comply. He secured the management of Gazprom. He dismantled media empires one by one. These moves would especially bring Gazprom directly under Kremlin control. Thus, the company became integrated into foreign policy. And as you can see today, its pricing policy has turned into a diplomatic weapon for Putin. He made most of those who had monopolized the industrial legacy submit. He prosecuted those who did not submit. However, he identified those who found a way to escape abroad and took their wealth with them. There were quite a few of them. They were so significant that at one point, Putin had to abandon the oligarch purge. Some were pardoned in exchange for offering their wealth to the service of the country. This meant new positions in the state structure and new advantages in trade. Putin saying, "My oligarch is good," also meant that there would not be a Russia without oligarchs. Today's oligarchs are those who remained from all this conflict, those who submitted, and those who took shelter under Putin's wings. In other words, the second-generation oligarchs. They are the owners of gas, oil, minerals, and banks. They sit atop the strategic sectors of the Russian economy. The difference from the first-generation oligarchs is that they now pledge unconditional and unquestioning allegiance to Putin, playing the game by his rules. The first rule is that they will not have political ambitions. The second rule is that they will not criticize the regime. The third rule is that they will enrich themselves without limits. And the fourth rule is that they will know how to share with Putin. The gossip created by the fourth rule is that Putin is currently one of the wealthiest people in the world.
Your oligarchs, they admit that they've accumulated great wealth, that they say that you led them to the wealth, that you are, in fact, the single richest person in the world.
I am the richest person on this planet.
After 2010, this excessive enrichment began to attract the attention of European countries. Gradually, the sources of the money coming from the oligarchs started to be questioned. The oligarchs, with their grand investments, gave these countries a kind of hush money. Today, we are experiencing one of the outcomes of this process. However, this time the oligarchs are being targeted. The United States, the European Union, the United Nations, and NATO, in short, the Western world's policy of expanding eastward, hit the Russian wall in Ukraine. When Putin said enough, it's my turn to speak, tragic images began to follow one after another. The West which was watching behind Ukraine, was content to just stay behind and applaud Zelensky.
We are defending our state alone. Just like yesterday. The most powerful forces in the world are watching from afar.
The Western world, unable to utter a single word to Russia on the battlefield, launched an economic war. The main targets were the oligarchs. In other words, Putin's men. Strange but true, the Western world went on a mega yacht hunt. Avon, Mordashov, Deripaska, Abramovich, Friedman, Uzmanov. The list of oligarchs and the list of seized oligarchs' mega yachts kept growing like this. According to Bloomberg, Russian billionaires who were among the world's 500 richest people suddenly lost $83 billion. Biden, on the other hand, was saying, this is just the beginning. The struggle is just starting. In his speech at the American Congress, he promised to hunt down the illicit gains of Russian oligarchs and seize their yachts, luxury apartments, and private jets. The United States Department of Justice created a unit responsible for this task. And they began investigating who is who worldwide. So why did these mega yachts always come to the forefront? How much does a mega yacht cost? The personal property of a few dozen individuals was used as a weapon against the vast Russia. The value of the 36 yachts subject to asset freezing is approximately $4 billion. So the cost of the most impressive mega yacht is equivalent to only 20 F-16s. So what difference does seizing a few $1 billion make in the clash of civilizations? It's not about a few yachts. Haven't you understood yet? If we explain it with that well-known phrase, this is essentially the summary of the matter. Indeed, right now, the West's focus is not just on the oligarchs, their extremely luxurious, ostentatious yachts, their mansions in different countries, or their accounts in various banks, but the main goal is to pressure Putin. Because everyone knows that these oligarchs owe a part of all these assets to Putin. And it was Putin who made the decision to invade Ukraine. That's why all the oligarchs close to Putin are being punished in a sense, with their properties being seized or frozen. There is also a difference between freezing and seizing. When they say freezing, it means you are freezing it for now, and they tell you to go file a lawsuit. Don't die now, my donkey, don't die. Whenever that lawsuit concludes, the legal process works differently in every country, varying according to the country. And as Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov recently said in Antalya, the West, in a sense, is using its own capital freedom against itself. Because many of these oligarchs have acquired citizenship in different countries and have become partners or owners of major, prestigious, world-renowned football teams, like Chelsea, for example. Now, freezing their assets with just 2 words in a day, although it still seems legally appropriate. But seizing them, no matter how you look at it, can be considered a very significant legal development that is highly debatable. Of course, the main calculation is, like once upon a time, workers of the world unite, now it's oligarchs of the world unite, meaning all Russian oligarchs unite, and either convince Putin or remove him from his seat so that we can release your assets again. The Western countries are saying you can now drink a glass of water over what we've seized. The founder of Rusal, the world's second largest aluminum company, Deripaska, has already turned against Putin. He announced that he no longer supports Putin immediately after his assets were frozen. And he said, we definitely need to put an end to this state capitalism. Abramovich, who frequently visits Bodrum with his yacht, foresaw what was going to happen and announced that he would donate the proceeds from Chelsea Football Club to the victims of the war in Ukraine and that he would sell the club. However, he could not prevent his assets in the UK from being seized. Let's see what the president of Monaco Football Club, Libolovlev, will do. Putin's favorite oligarchs, Emperor Usmanov and Transneft CEO Tokarev. Russia experts believe that Putin is not sitting idly by They claim that he is preparing to prevent the mass defection of oligarchs, distancing himself from oligarchic friendships and leaving only political and economic comrades around him. They also don't find it likely that those who owe their wealth to Putin will show disloyalty. Still, they leave the door open to the possibility that if Putin cannot extinguish the economic fire, the Russian people revolt, and the oligarchs ally with them, then Russia might become too small for Putin. There is also a possibility that sanctions on the oligarchs could backfire. In the hangars of the aircraft manufacturer Airbus, 13 planes produced for the Russian airline company Aeroflot are still waiting. While 90% of their costs were to be paid upon delivery, these flying giants, each worth approximately 150 million euros, have become a burden for the company. Hundreds of retail chains are indecisive about whether to leave a growing market. All eyes are on Kyiv. Will Ukraine fall? When will the Russians end the invasion? Everyone is watching this. However, on the other hand, oligarchs arriving in Turkey are being counted one by one on private jets. In state banks, dozens of Russians whose names we do not know are opening various accounts. We don't know how Russia's invasion of Ukraine will end in the coming days, but already 146 business people close to Putin or their close relatives have been punished, their assets seized, or sanctions have begun to be applied. Who isn't among them? The list includes giants in coal, fertilizer, steel, and food. Merlichenko, Guriev, Pumpyans, Moscovici, and Foreign Minister Lavrov's son-in-law, Vinokurov, were included. 14 oligarchs, including chemical baron Mazepin and his Formula One driver son Nikita, as well as 146 members of the Russian Federal Council, seem to have been included in the sanctions. Looking at it this way, one might feel sorry for the oligarchs. Just think about all that money. You've earned millions, billions of dollars, in a sense. You've taken it out of Russia. You've parked it in banks of various countries. You've bought mega yachts, you've bought mansions, and all of it is either frozen or confiscated overnight with a single decision by Putin. One would never think they'd feel sorry even for the oligarchs, believe me.